Welcome to the psychology of personality. This is a field that I think you're going to find stimulating and exciting, and I'm hoping as we go through a number of rather fascinating theorists that you will find your own sense of understanding personality will grow substantially. And in addition, the field of personality is really a characteristic of psychology that is almost unique. If you look at other fields, you will find that psychology really is the only field that scientifically pursues the study of personality. Now, I'm Dr. Edward Sheridan, and I will be the instructor for your course. And in this course, you will find we study a number of people. And importantly, you'll learn a lot about their history, because actually the history of some of the theorists has a lot of meaning in terms of how they developed concepts and how they decided to pursue understanding human behavior. So it may be helpful if you know a little bit about me, since I obviously will bring some biases to this course also. I am a professor of clinical psychology, and you'll find that most of the theorists we study, in fact the vast majority, actually were clinicians themselves. I also have a diplomate in clinical health psychology, and that's a credential you get after 3 or more years of practice if you're willing to take an exam where you present diagnoses, you present treatment, you're examined on ethics. And so much of my career has been in the field of clinical psychology. And the longest period was at Northwestern University Medical School, where I spent 17 years. 8 of those years, I was the chief of psychiatry outpatient services, and 9 of those following 9 years, I was professor and chair in psychology. And I tell you that so that you will be aware that many of the clinical examples I will use in this course actually come from that experience. And you will also realize that my exposure for much of my life was to people who were either very emotionally troubled, had significant physical problems, or both. Also, you'll find most of our theorists have a real interest in childhood, and their own childhoods play into how they see things. In my case, I am the first child in the Sheridan side of the family who was born in the United States. I'm also the first child in the history of the family, and my father felt very sure about this. I'm the first to graduate from grade school. My parents, grew up in Ireland. They lived in rather impoverished circumstances. Their homes had no running water, no electricity, no plumbing. They had outhouses. In the home, they had dirt floors. So they grew up very needy. And you can see that in one generation, because of their generosity and their kindness, I was able to have a very fine education. Now, my hope for you is that this course will be both intellectually stimulating and it will assist you to reflect on yourself. That is, as you study these various theorists, I am hoping that some of these concepts you will find very meaningful for understanding your behavior. Perhaps there are issues you've been thinking about. You may get new insights as a result of being able to study this material. And if that happens, that would be just fine. I also want to alert you right from the beginning that while I have told you the information in this course is very stimulating, the first lecture you may find somewhat dry because we have to define a number of variables and we have to put a certain amount of information out as background that you will need in order to understand the course as it moves along. Now, in order to do well in the course, I would suggest some of the following. It's very important that you read your syllabus carefully. The teaching assistant for this course and myself have worked hard to try to put a lot of information into the syllabus so that it will be possible for you to know just what we expect of you. And in the syllabus, you'll note that I indicate I assume you have read the material in the textbook before you watch the lecture. That can be very helpful to you because when you read the material in the textbook, you may find it will raise questions. And many of the questions that are raised actually get answered in the lectures. So my suggestion to you would be read the material that's assigned to you in the syllabus, then watch the lecture. The exams for this course will be a combination of multiple choice and true and false. Each exam will have both kinds of questions. And I do want to guarantee you there will be no trivia on the exams. That is, I am not going to ask you for dates. I'm not going to ask you for people's birthplaces. There's no attempt to try to see have you memorized everything in the course. The exams actually will focus on broad concepts and on your understanding of the material that's been presented. Some of you may be familiar with education systems which really place a lot of emphasis on mastering specific content and then being able to give that back in exams. And so in those systems, it's not uncommon that the professor summarizes everything just before an exam to be sure you know what is going to be on the exam. In research universities like this one, we usually don't do that. I will give you a lot of material. I will assume you are working at integrating it and understanding it. And the exams test how well have you done that. So there won't be a summary lecture before each exam telling you what material is important. I think the outline I've just given you will tell you what's important. Now, in this course, though, if you want to know what would be especially relevant for exams, if you notice that your textbook has a significant amount of material on something, and then you noticed that I lectured on that same material or similar material, and then if you notice I also created slides for the material, it's a pretty good bet that that's on the exam. So you might want to, as you go through, to realize if it's getting a lot of emphasis from me and the textbook, it's probably going to be on the exam. I also want to alert you that there will be material on the exam that you'll only find in the lectures. There'll also be material on the exam that you may only find in the book. There are places in the book where I think the author has done such a good job, there really isn't any need for me to repeat it, but the material is important and it will be on the exam. I also want to emphasize that you should feel free to contact the teaching assistant or myself anytime. If you have questions, don't hesitate to ask them. If you find that the material in the lectures is not clear for some reason, and it's not clear in the book, don't hesitate to ask for clarification. Or if the syllabus itself is unclear, please feel very free to ask us to clarify something because it looks ambiguous to you. We've tried to make it clear, but that doesn't mean that it is. Now, in beginning these theories, I do want to emphasize there is no scientifically established theory of personality. What you will find is that in all of our theories, there are some aspects of the theory that actually have rather good scientific validation. And there are other aspects that are still being examined or probably don't have much promise. But when the theory was first put forward, that's the way the theorists saw it. Now, it's also important not to be overly literal about things. You'll find, for example, most of your theories focus on the fact that people grow up in a family with a mother and father. If you did not, for example, if you grew up with a single parent Maybe you didn't have parents. Maybe your grandparents raised you. That doesn't mean the theory won't apply to your development. What you have to do is to think metaphorically and to be imaginative and to realize that it's very likely there was somebody in your life who played predominantly a mother role, that is a female role, and someone who played a masculine role and kind of taught you those values and those qualities and related to you in the way in which we often think males and females relate to children. And so, you know, if you didn't have a mom, you may have had a nanny who took that role, or you may have had an aunt. If you're raised in a family where your parents were gay, it doesn't mean you didn't have a feminine influence and a masculine influence. It's not unusual in such families that one person is more focused on the masculine role, another person is more focused on the feminine role. So while your theories kind of presume what we think of as a traditional family, you may have to be imaginative if you're trying to apply some of it to yourself, and you find that I grew up in a different environment. Now, psychology's interest is in studying personality scientifically. And as I just said earlier, there really is no other discipline that makes that claim. For example, literature certainly studies personality. All of you have read novels or read biographies, etc., where a lot of emphasis is put on trying to understand a person. But there's no attempt to say that this is somewhat universal, or that we've established this theory on the basis of studying a lot of people. The same is true in drama. I mean, drama certainly presents personalities in plays, and often one finds that these presentations tell us a lot about human nature, but it's not scientific information that we get. Philosophy certainly believes that it studies personality, and it does study personality, but surely it does not do so scientifically. So you want to be aware of the fact that psychology really puts its energy into the science of studying personality. And what will be important for you is to be able to recognize that if you master this material, it will come up again in other courses if you're going to be taking psychology courses. For example, personality theory and studies of personality really underlie our understanding of abnormal psychology or psychopathology. And also, you know, theories of personality are very relevant in trying to understand psychotherapy and psychological interventions. One needs to know what is it that they're trying to address. Also, if you take courses in child psychology or adolescent psychology, many of these theorists will appear again. So if you master this material, you really will find that it will be very helpful to you as you study psychology in other contexts. Personality certainly is a very complex topic, and there are a number of variables that we look at and try to integrate in order that we can describe personality in the multidimensional way that it really needs to be described. So, for example, there are biological variables. I mean, think genetics, for example, plays a real role in your development. Your IQ. Estimates vary with different scholars, but most people would agree probably at least 80% of your IQ is genetically determined. Now, in a class like this one, where you've got all these bright people, what you find is that you will probably be more reflective than many people in society. You will probably be more questioning. You probably will try to take this material and see how it applies to you, how it applies to other people that you might love. And part of that is due to the fact that you're bright. Whereas someone, let's say, whose intelligence is below what we might think of as normal, they might not be so reflective. They might not see as many variables as you will see. And they might not have the same interests that you would have. Another biological variable is your physiology. And we all know we think a lot about our physiology in the sense of the characteristics that make us up. And some people use their physiology very well, understand what gifts they have, understand their limitations. Others don't. You know, for example, if we had a young man in 11th grade in high school who was 5'6", and his aspiration is to be the center on the basketball team, that's probably not a very insightful choice. He also probably won't be successful. So his aspirations won't be realized. And that might not be a very wise thing for him to pursue because it may lead to a lot of failure experiences. One could say the same thing if you had a female who, let's say, is 6'6", and she wants to be an actress. If you start thinking about it, how many roles are there for 6'6" women in plays or movies, etc.? So here's someone who, because she aspires to something, may well be defeating her aspirations. Or, you know, she may find an extraordinarily creative way to kind of spectacularly use her height to be a star. But if you were encouraging that person, you probably would encourage her to think more about being a director, being a choreographer, being a writer, you know, in other words, getting involved in the film or the acting world in a way other than being an actress, because probably that's a limitation that she has just because of her height. Now then there's the environment that you grow up in. And of course, this where the family is key. And if the family has encouraged you to be independent and to be risk-taking, it's likely, you know, you will develop a personality where you are more open to looking at lots of alternatives. You are more open to being able to make choices, and if they fail, to say, okay, that didn't work, I'm going to try something else. School also certainly plays a role, and when we study people, say like Erik Erikson, you'll see he really emphasizes what can happen to you during those years. But you know, in our world today, there are some students who go to schools where the student is really encouraged to take risks, to explore new ideas, to write, to try to be creative, etc. And in contrast, there are schools where the world of the student is very rigid. The important thing to the teacher is don't make noise. Don't get up and wander around the room. Don't do things unless I tell you. Now, you can imagine, certainly, depending on which of those two school systems I described you grow up in, you may be a very different person. You may be, on one hand, a very outgoing, creative, explorative kind of person, or you may be a very rigid and even frightened person. Then culture also plays an important role in this field. Many of you probably are familiar with a woman named Sandra Day O'Connor. Sandra Day O'Connor is a retired Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. Now, when Sandra Day O'Connor came out of law school, and she graduated second at Stanford Law School, and when she began to look for a job, you would assume this woman graduated second at Stanford Law School. She is probably inundated with jobs. Not true. In her day, nobody offered her a job. I mean, here's a woman with this wonderful education, second at Stanford. The best job she was offered was that of being a paralegal, which in those days was mostly a secretarial position, and it did not require a law degree. Now, what's wonderful is that this woman went from being in a culture like that, that was very unaccepting of her, to still getting a position as a lawyer and eventually ending up on the Supreme Court. And you rarely find that. Now, our culture is changing. And so many of you in this class will have opportunities, let's say, that someone like her did not have. I can tell you in my own family, when my wife was a professor in a medical school, she decided to go and get a law degree. And now when she was getting her PhD, She was the only woman in her class. When she went to law school, about a third of the students in her class were women. This was maybe 15 years after she had gotten her PhD. And so a third of the women were in the law class, a third of the students were women, and 6 of those women already had doctorates in other fields. In that very same law school today, more than half the students are women. So, you look and you see, what the culture encourages, what the culture permits, and you get people who either have opportunities or they do not have opportunities, but that certainly influences the way their personalities develop. That is, if someone feels they can do a lot versus they feel they're kind of trapped. Then there are interpersonal relationships. And if you're in interpersonal relationships where you feel safe, where you're encouraged to be innovative, where the other person is innovative, you probably will be happy, be comfortable, and explore a lot. On the other hand, if you've experienced a lot of rejection, you may find in relationships you don't want much to happen. That is, you're frightened that if the other person does something new, this will be bad. Things will go wrong for me. So you don't want this to happen. And so the result will be relationships for this latter person are best, or are experienced as best, when they're rigid. There's not a lot of innovation, there's not a lot of change, there's not a lot of risk-taking, because this person associates change with rejection. Now, I've been saying to you, psychology is interested in studying personality scientifically. That's an important distinction that I'll make several times. Now, you may feel that you're familiar with personality. Most everybody actually feels they're familiar with personality. And because in the popular culture, it has meanings. But often those meanings have very little to do with the way in which the field of psychology goes about trying to study personality. When I was a young man, for example, it wasn't unusual for a mother to say to her son, "I have a friend, and she has a daughter who has a very nice personality." Now, if you were a young man and this happened to you, you heard this as a code word. This meant, my mother has a friend and she has a daughter that I'm supposed to date. But it's obvious nobody else is dating her. So I strongly suspect, she is not attractive, she is not sexy, she is not fun, and I've got to find a way not to get involved in this. So here you have a statement like someone has a nice personality, but it has all negative connotations. And in our culture, you find that personality gets used that way. We will be much more specific. Now, in the beginning, in this course, we're going to talk about theories. And essentially, you can break theories down into 2 kinds. There are what we call inductive theories. Now, inductive theories are established by gathering a lot of data about people, and after you have a lot of data and you statistically examine it, you find there are significant differences between groups of people, and so you begin to posit there are certain variables that are important. For example, later on, we're going to study a man named Psyc. And Psyc made the observation that people seem to either be motivated by internal variables, that is, they think about issues, they reflect on what would make them feel good, what they desire to do, how they might be effective, and then that drives their behavior, the inner world of the person. He also observed there seem to be other people who look outside themselves. And what they do is they try to observe, what is it that other people want from me? And as they begin to get insights about what other people might like them to do, they begin to behave in certain ways. So if they feel people would like me to be quiet, they become quiet. If they feel people would like me to be gregarious, then they become very talkative. But it's always in response to what they think the other world wants. So Psyc then developed a theory about introversion, extroversion. And he developed scales where he could study this phenomenon and found indeed there are groups of people that one would think of as introverts. Most of their behavior is determined by their own reflections on themselves and their own values. There are other people that he labeled as extroverts, and in this case that meant the person is looking out to see what is it that people in society want from me. And once there's an awareness of what people want, the person's behavior is likely to be guided by that. Now the other kind of theory we're going to deal with we call deductive theories. And deductive theories develop when someone observes a small sample of people, just even a few people, and the person looks for commonalities in the backgrounds of these people, and then develops a theory about what most everybody is like. Now, this latter, the deductive theories are often ones that were formed by clinicians, that is, clinical psychologists especially, or psychiatrists in the past. And these people see a number of patients, maybe not a whole lot of patients, but they make observations that are common to these people, and then they start developing a theory of personality. This, in some ways, is fraught with problems, although it's very popular, because clinicians tend to be working with people who have problems. It's a subpopulation of the general population, and clinicians are working with people who are trying to deal with something usually that's painful. And then the clinician tries to imagine, well, if this person's life had been different, or if some experiences had been different, how would this individual have developed? And often then builds a theory of personality on those observations. Also in the field of personality, we have different approaches. One approach we call the experimental approach. And in the experimental approach is very similar to what I just mentioned about Psyc, that is, you gather a lot of data, and you may use scientifically validated tests or scales, or you may use projective tests, but you use tests, you gather data, and then you statistically analyze the data in order to determine what are the differences in various populations. And if you find statistically that these populations are different, then you can posit things like the introversion, extroversion example that I gave you. In a true experimental study, what you do is you try to isolate a variable and study it to see how can you change that variable. Let's take anxiety as an easy one. Let's say you got a group of anxious people. And so you split your group of anxious people, all of whom are very anxious, and you randomly put half of them into a group that is going to get some psychological intervention. And the other half is put on a waiting list. And then you run your psychological intervention for a number of sessions, and then you retest everybody. Now, if the group that got the psychological intervention now has significantly less anxiety than the group that was on the waiting list, one assumes that the intervention that was used was effective, because the assumption is that since all of these people were anxious and we tried to control for lots of variables that were going on in their life, the one really significant difference for these two groups is that one got this intervention, one didn't. Now that's the experimental method. It does get, and for those of you who have taken statistics, you'll find and already know, It does get more complicated than that, though, because in science we also talk about correlational studies, and your textbook will talk about a number of correlational studies. And that's really quite different, because we're not sure that causation exists here. Like, for example, supposing you were assigned to study a group of people who had lost their jobs, and you found that a large preponderance of the people that you're studying who lost their jobs were actually depressed during the 3-month period before they lost their jobs. High correlation. Depressed, lose job. It wouldn't be unreasonable for you to assume that with such a correlation, probably their depressed mood contributed to why they lost their job, especially in tough times where people have to be so productive. But we don't know that for sure. And in fact, while you were doing your study, if you gathered all kinds of data, you might have even discovered there's an even higher correlation between people who lost their jobs and people who have brown eyes. High correlation, let's say you find. Absolutely meaningless. You haven't learned anything. I mean, nobody would go around and make their decisions on the basis of whether someone should continue their job or not on the basis of what their eye color is. So you can have what might be meaningful correlations, although they don't tell you causation, like the case of being depressed and losing a job. Or you may have, like the brown eyes, utterly meaningless correlation. So you have data, but they really don't tell you anything. Now, the other method that I want to mention is called the case study method. And this is the method where clinicians drive theories, as I referred to earlier, by seeing a small number of patients, listening to problems, and then generating a theory from the observations they make from a small number of people. So the data they have simply are the stories or the histories that their patients give them, and often not a lot of data, but some people who are very perceptive have generated some very interesting and even exciting theories. You'll find in our course that the early people we study mostly use the case method. They were clinicians, and they observed a number of people, and then they developed a theory. As we go on, you'll find people get more and more experimental. And as we get towards the end of our theorists, you'll find people are heavily involved in data gathering, in a very sophisticated statistical analyses of variables, and that they are trying very hard to show that the variables that they say are important in personality actually can be scientifically tested. I'm now going to begin with our first theory, and it's called psychoanalytic theory, psychoanalysis, started by a man named Sigmund Freud. And Sigmund Freud has had a big impact on our culture, and actually began having a significant impact about the early 1900s. And it continued, and it really flourished, especially in the 1950s and 1960s. Now it's beginning to get diminished because we have many more theories, we have many more insights about personality, and so Freud's theory is not as preponderant as it once was. However, you will certainly find that many of the theorists that we will study actually built their theory after examining Freud and modified his theory because they thought there were some observations of his that were not correct. So if you're going to understand a lot of theories, you need to understand Freud to understand why people change things. And Freud not only had a big impact, by the way, on culture in general, but he had a very big impact on the field of mental illness, where theories about mental illness were developed from his observations, and also theories of intervention. And we've just gone on to improve on all those things. Also, Freud developed his theory, as I mentioned, from listening to adult patients. And he listened to these patients and their recollections of what went on in their childhood. So while we're going to study a lot of things that Freud proposed about childhood, he actually did not study children. He actually studied adults and simply made his inferences by listening to what they recollected from being children. Now, he also exploded the myth, and the people had a lot of trouble with this, but he exploded the myth that childhood was a period of internal quiet, when a child kind of peacefully grew into adolescence and adulthood, and there wasn't a lot going on. And as you're going to see, Freud posits right from birth, there's a whole lot going on with children. In fact, the first premise in his theory was that beginning in infancy, all people are driven by what he called the pleasure principle, or pleasure seeking. And so, operating from adult concepts, Freud postulated that the most intense pleasure from the perspective of an adult would be a sexual orgasm. So he began talking in sexual terms about everyone. And when people heard him talking about sexual feelings in infants and little children, they became very upset with him. And also probably was a real mistake, in his proposing his theory, because had he focused more that people are seeking pleasure, that might have been accepted. But when he used the word sexual, as you'll see in his writings, that became hard for people to accept. Now, what is the case with Freud is that he has many concepts and constructs and stages. And we're going to try to examine all of these in a systematic way. What you want to know about this particular theory is that it's what we call an instinctual theory. This means that people are primarily motivated by biological needs. And importantly, it's the energy that is generated by one's biological needs. An energy, by the way, that Freud called libido, L-I-B-I-D-O. And Freud said that it's this libido, this primitive energy, that drives all people. And libido's only goal is to express itself and to experience pleasure. Now, later in his career, Freud found he couldn't account for everything with the libido theory. So he came up with observations, people are also quite self-destructive many times. So he talked about a death instinct. And he felt he needed to do it to kind of complete the theory. But he never came up with an energy source for it, like the libido. And he never really fully accounted in a satisfactory way for death instincts. And so you won't read a lot about them, and it won't get a lot of attention in our course. But he found it necessary to do this in order to complete his theory. Now, we're going to go to our first slide. And this slide is important if you want to understand the psychic structure that Freud created. Now, if you look at the slide, you'll notice we have iceberg concept. And the iceberg concept is actually a famous one, in that Freud was positing most of your psychic energy is like an iceberg in the sense that it's unknown to you. It's unconscious. So what you will find is that for Freud, when he was examining people, he thought, most of what people do is irrational. So he developed this metaphor. And in the metaphor, if you think about icebergs, most of an iceberg you can't see. Most of the iceberg is way down under the sea. However, if you look into water, for the first couple of feet or so, you can actually see some of the iceberg, and then the smallest part of the iceberg usually is what's exposed. Now, if you notice in our concept then, the unconscious is located way below the water. That means that most of your psychic energy can't be seen. What he really was saying, you can't experience it directly. You don't realize how much is going on inside you. The preconscious, which is just below the surface, refers to the fact that you can get in touch with that if you want. I mean, for example, if somebody asked you, did you have a good time in junior high school? You're probably not thinking about that right now, but the reality is, if you were asked, you could recall memories. You could say, yeah, it was a great time, I really liked it, or no, I didn't like it, or some of it was good, some of it wasn't. But you're not thinking about it right now, but you have access to it. That's the preconscious. The conscious, which is really the smallest part of your psyche, is what you are thinking about now. And obviously it changes a lot depending on what you're really considering. That's an error, by the way, in the way in which I did this slide, because the conscious should be the smallest section. So I should have raised the preconscious higher, and the conscious should be the smaller section. Now, whoop. Okay. I think I made an error. Aha. Okay. Now, Freud, from what I've just told you, from the libido, that is this energy that's in you that's really trying to express itself and find pleasure, he developed a theory about what is your psychic structure like. And he said there are three elements to your structure. First of all, there's what he called the id. In many ways, the id is kind of synonymous with libido, in that it's the location in your psychological makeup where all these id impulses exist. And it's driven by the pleasure principle, meaning all this energy is simply doing is seeking to express itself in a way that you will find gratifying. And so you notice we say it is unconscious. That is, you don't recognize that you're so intensely trying to satisfy these urges. Now, what he recognized is that if people were only responsive to their id, we would have chaos in our world. That is, everybody would just be seeking to do things for themselves. So he said in order for individuals to function in society, they needed to develop what he termed an ego. And the ego became the mediator that permits a person to function in society so that the person doesn't express impulses or seek gratifications that would offend other people or cause the person to have very unpleasant experiences. So the ego becomes this very important source of negotiating with the world. However, Freud also recognized that people seem to be controlled by more than their ego. That is, it seems as if people make decisions about what they're going to do in relationship to others that don't necessarily seem to be reflections about what's going on right now. So he posited a third mechanism, which he called the superego. And what happened here is he realized that the unconscious is controlled by more than the ego. And now, people have likened the superego to a conscience. And people will talk about the superego as kind of your conscience. That's an error. That is not accurate. Conscience actually is a spiritual value. It's an important value, and it's a value that you have that allows you to, upon reflection, to decide that you should not hurt other people, perhaps you should not steal from other people, or you shouldn't lie. But it comes from reflection and beliefs on your part that this is how society should function and this is how you should interact. The superego is very different. The superego, first of all, is learned from parents. And it's the parents interpreting to a child what you can do and not do that leads to the development of the superego. And so the child, for instance, is not making a decision to not harm somebody because they think that that's bad. They're making the decision because their parents would punish them. And so the child doesn't do certain things, not because he has a conscience or she has a conscience and they think this is morally what you should do, but rather the superego is a warning mechanism that you don't want to do this because mom and dad wouldn't approve, and in fact, you might even get punished. Now, if you take that into consideration, then one of the things that happens is you begin to say, well, if you learn all this from mom and dad, then why is it that all the kids in the family don't have the same kind of superego? Because when you observe kids, some kids are much more risk-taking than others in the same family. Some kids will try behaviors other kids don't. And so Freud explained this by saying what actually happens is children project onto their parents what they think their parents' values are, what they think their parents want them to do, and how they think they can get rewarded by doing certain things that their parents ask. So each child makes different judgments about the parents, and besides that, the parents may have changed over time. So you won't have every child developing the same superego just because they have the same parents. Also, there's a second aspect of the superego. Well, I'll take just one second. There's a second aspect of the superego that we call the ego ideal. And the ego ideal develops as a result of the child observing what is it that parents reward. And so as the child makes these observations and begins to recognize, if I do this, mom and dad are really pleased. If I don't do this, mom and dad get upset. So the ego ideal becomes for the child that set of behaviors that if I do them, I will get the most rewards, and also those behaviors that if I avoid them, I will get the most rewards. And so the child strives to be this excellent kind of person that mom and dad will only be pleased with. Now, naturally, if parents encourage very healthy behavior in children, that is a behavior we would see as good in a society, then, you know, the superego is not a problem for people in adulthood, and it just helps them to do well in society. But if parents are very rigid and demanding, and someone develops a very rigid superego, that can be a problem, because later on in life, the person is caught having to look at what he or she is doing and to live in great fear that things could go wrong. To give you an example, if you've ever had a boss where, you know, your boss gives you 6 things to do, and you do 5 of them, and actually, you know, your own view is, I really have done these things very well. But your boss comes along and doesn't say anything to you about the 5 things you've done well, but points out you didn't do the 6th thing. And you wonder, you know, what's with this person? I mean, this is a horrible thing. Well, that boss probably has a very rigid superego, and in his world, the 5 things you did right are not important. You should have done them right. But the one thing you didn't do well, that may cause people to reflect poorly on him. So he has no interest in your feelings, no interest in your accomplishments, no interest in the fact that you've been hurt. His focus solely is, I, as a boss, am failing because I'm not doing everything that I'm supposed to be doing. That's what we mean by a very rigid superego. Now, I just want to touch on an item before we end this lecture, and that's a very interesting phenomena that we call ego defense mechanisms. And you'll see in this particular slide that what happens with these well, first of all, let me just summarize and say ego defense mechanisms basically represent a way in which you express unacceptable impulses in an acceptable way. Now, what Freud posited was early in life, someone has a traumatic experience. And the traumatic experience is upsetting. But the person is not allowed to express the feelings they have about this experience, so they repress them. And repression means driving these unacceptable impulses back into your unconscious. However, those impulses are bouncing around there. They're trying to seek some gratification, and defense mechanisms are the way in which you express that energy in an acceptable way. An example. Supposing, take an oldest child. Oldest child is the only child for a certain period. So let's say the oldest child is the only child for a couple of years. A new child is born. Let's say the oldest child is a boy, youngest child is a girl. This new kid is not desired by the oldest child. In fact, the oldest child realizes, they're giving this kid all kinds of attention. I used to get all that attention. I don't need this other kid. And the oldest child may really want to get rid of the youngest child, but they can't because they see the parents would be very upset. And they may even test it out a little bit by hitting the child, and they find the parents jump all over him. So the kid realizes, I can't express this anger I feel towards this new baby here who's getting all this attention. So the child has to repress those feelings. But the child also needs to express that he doesn't want this kid around. So he may develop some ingenious plan. I remember in one case, what the oldest child did is, when people came over to his house, the oldest child had observed the family was poor, the family needed money, so the oldest child would say to people, would you like to buy my sister? And of course everybody thought this was really cute, so he got a lot of attention for this. But he would say, would you like to buy my sister? And you know, if you, and this example was used some time ago, so he asked for a quarter. He thought a quarter was a lot of money. And what he thought was, if I can sell my sister, I'll get a quarter. I can give it to mom and dad. They will be very pleased because they need money. And on top of that, I'll be rid of my sister. So the child, not being able to hit his sister, or as maybe a lot of young children might like to do, like, let's just put her outside with the garbage, not knowing you can't do those kind of things, but you got to find some way to get rid of her. He finds an exciting way in which he sells her, that is, he offers to sell her. People like it, so now he's getting a lot more attention than he used to get because people think this is so cute. He knows that if he pulls off the sale and gives the money to his parents, that is, his belief is, his parents will be very pleased because they now have money, and everybody will be happy. Now that's one example of a defense mechanism. That is, you get to see that something that would have been socially unacceptable, like putting the child outside the door, becomes socially acceptable, and at the same time, in the psyche of the child, he is moving towards trying to find a way to maximize his gratification. Now, what we are going to do in our next lecture is I am going to talk with you very concretely and give you lots of examples about different kinds of defense mechanisms. Some of them I think you will clearly recognize in yourselves or in other people. And I think this was a really legitimate insight that Freud had. And I think you'll find it fascinating to begin to examine how this really gets played out in life. But for today, we're going to stop.